It's All Saints' Day, and that's what we're going to talk about, but perhaps with a slightly different twist. I'm going to look at just one part of what it means to be All Saints' Day. But before we do that, I'm going to start with a little bit of history. And I think you'll enjoy the history, and it'll give you an idea of how we got here to All Saints' Day. The first Sunday after the Feast of Holy Pentecost is observed by the Orthodox Church as the Sunday of All Saints. This day has been designated as a commemoration of all the saints, all the righteous, the prophets, apostles, martyrs, confessors, shepherds, teachers, and holy monastics, both men and women alike, known and unknown, who have been added to the choirs of the saints and shall be added from the time of Adam until the end of the world, who have been perfected in piety and have glorified God by their holy lives. Now that's the official definition. It comes right out of the website of the Greek Archdiocese of America. I mean, you can look it up. And I want you to catch a couple of things. It is the celebration of all saints, known and unknown, who have been added to the choirs of saints. All Saints did not originally begin as All Saints' Day. That's what it is today. Originally, it began as the Sunday of All Martyrs. And in fact, you can catch that in today's reading of Scripture, can't you? What are the two readings of Scripture? One of them is from Hebrews. Brethren, all the saints through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, were killed by the sword, got cut in two, died faithfully. Doesn't that sound like martyrs? And even the second reading from the gospel, if you're not willing to give up father and mother, like many of the early martyrs had to say to their parents, no, I am going to follow the Lord, and they were disowned by their own parents before they were killed. The readings are martyr readings. The troparion for today, your church is arrayed in the holy blood of your martyrs, which, by the way, is why we're wearing red. What you're supposed to see when you look at us is we're dressed in blood. We're dressed in the blood of the martyrs. Now, in my case, I happen to have another divine liturgy that I need to celebrate at a mission this afternoon, so I'm not fully arrayed for divine liturgy. Nevertheless, I'm wearing what looks like a river of blood flowing down me. I am arrayed in the blood of the martyrs, because originally this was not All Saints' Day at all. It was All Martyrs' Day. The Kontakion, O planter of creation, Lord, to you does the entire world bring as an offering the God-bearing martyr saints as being nature's first fruits. Now, think of that image. As the martyr is planted in the ground, he's been killed, so he's buried. He actually becomes, and one of the early church fathers talked about the blood of the martyrs being the seed of the church. They become the first fruits. And as they are planted, as they die for the Lord, as they're buried, their witness becomes the witness of the church, and grace flows, and the church grows. And in fact, the church grew strongly. One of the feasts that we celebrate during the year is about the 20 Roman soldiers who, having seen the Christians die before them in the Colosseum, leaped out from their seats and leaped over the wall and joined them and died, because the blood of the martyrs so spoke to them. And actually, there are several saints of which it can be said in their history that they came to the Lord precisely because they saw a martyr die. And that's what the Kontakion is talking about. That planting, and it's a pun, like I said earlier, planting as a seed planted in your casket, that pun, that planting, is what becomes the seed for the church to grow. So how did we get to All Saints? And let me return to history a bit, because I really am headed somewhere with this. Now, In the East, you can read St. John Chrysostom, and in the West, St. Maximus of Turin, and both of them preach in the 400s and 500s about All Martyrs Day. It isn't till the 800s that it changes. The Emperor Leo VI, who lived from 866 to 911, insisted that all the saints, known and unknown, needed to be celebrated. And it's under his reign that the celebration of all the martyrs changes to All Saints. And it was also at the same time that it became a much more important feast. All Saints, frankly, used to be not that important. Not until Emperor Leo VI. Now, in the West, it's in the 700s that it begins to change, and that's under Pope Leo III. Now, remember, at this point, we were still one church. The Great Schism hadn't happened. Pope Leo moves it to November. And in the West, the 1st of November becomes All Saints' Day. In the East, in the 800s, All Martyrs' Day becomes All Saints' Day. In fact, in the West, and you might possibly enjoy this, in England, the old word for saint was different than it is nowadays. And you catch it in the traditional form of the Our Father. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Hallowed be thy name. And we know from Greek that the holy ones are the saints. In England, it was called All Hallows Day. And the Vespers before, the eve of the feast, was called All Hallows Eve, from which we get Halloween. So that's where the name Halloween comes from, All Hallows Eve. But in France, in the 10th century, this was again before the Great Schism, a saint who became very influential in the West, Saint Odilo of Cluny. The famous monastery at Cluny, if you grew up in the Western liturgical tradition, which I did before I converted to Orthodoxy, the monastery at Cluny became one of the leading monastic lights in the West beginning in the 10th century. And it's under this saint. And this saint begins to say, but wait a minute, aren't all who die in the Lord and who have gone to be with the Lord, aren't they also saints? After all, isn't the definition of saint not just that you're holy, but that you're also living in the presence of God? And so he starts a holiday that is not found in the East, and it's All Faithfully Departed. All Faithfully Departed, which became nicknamed the Day of the Dead, and in Mexico, I'm Latino, the Dia de los Muertos, became the day when you celebrated your relatives who had died in the faith. That was the day that often graves were blessed, that you went to visit your relatives. In Latin countries, you even take a picnic with you, and you often may have a picnic there in the mausoleum that holds the bones of your ancestors. Now, in the East, it tended to become Saturday of Souls. I almost said All Souls Saturday. Saturday of Souls. And did we not, on May 31st, just go out and bless some graves ourselves? In some of the Slavic Orthodox countries, they adopted All Souls Day, All Faithfully Departed Day. And it becomes, and the reason that St. Odilo asked that question was because the church at his time was basically living in peace. You know, the great Visigoth invasions of the West had finished. The Frankish Empire had stabilized things. And even though the Muslims were rising up, that was more of a problem in the East than it was in the West. You know, the Moors had been stopped in the 780s in France, and the Spanish were beginning to drive down the country until the Moors were driven out. But the question is, if we no longer have sort of the great martyrs because society is peaceful, you know, what does it mean to honor the saints and those who will be? Does it mean only the monastics? Because I will tell you that in monastic theology, what happened was that as the number of martyrs died down going into the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, monastics start talking about the monastics being the church's martyrs. They're the ones who have given up father and mother and left everything behind in order to pray for the whole world. And so that the spirit of martyrdom is carried out in the monastic communities by their fasting, by their prayer, by their leaving behind father and mother, not necessarily by being physically killed, but by putting to death their own flesh in order that they might come to know the Lord, in order that they might experience the uncreated light of the Lord. But St. Odilo asks, what about the everyday person? And in fact, you find a question of that type in the Ladder of Divine Ascent, which was written a couple centuries, I should say, pulled together a couple of centuries after that. And a person comes to St. John of the Ladder, and he records that some people in the world have asked me. In other words, some people in the world, people who were not monks. It did not mean that they were misbehaving. It meant they were not monks, have asked me. We have wives and many social concerns. How could we possibly lead a life of solitude? I answered them, do as much good as you can. Do not speak ill of anyone. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not be boastful. Do not hate. Go to church. Have mercy on the poor. Do not be a stumbling block to anyone. Do not draw near the bed of another, and be satisfied with what you receive from your wives. If you do these things, you will be close to the kingdom of heaven. Now, I want you to catch that last line. If you do these things, you will be close to the kingdom of heaven. And the reason I want you to catch that is, if you're close to the kingdom of heaven, what are you? A saint. If you're close to the kingdom of heaven, you're a saint. So for you and me, this is an important paragraph, and in fact, John the Baptist says something similar when he was asked some questions. Because that paragraph and what I'm going to read from John the Baptist in a minute or two answers the question, how do you and I become saints? This is All Saints' Day. And I'd like to think that when I die and I'm buried, that people will think, oh, that priest is going to be with the Lord. Because what they will be saying is, that priest has become a saint. Let me read John the Baptist real quick. So people asked him, John the Baptist, saying, what shall we do then? He answered and said to them, he who has 2 tunics, let him give to him who has none. He who has food, let him do likewise. Then tax collectors also came to be baptized and said to him, teacher, what shall we do? And he said to them, collect no more than is appointed for you. Likewise, the soldiers asked him, saying, and what shall we do? So he said to them, do not intimidate anyone or accuse falsely, and be content with your wages. Now, in the 2 paragraphs that I read, the one from the Ladder of Divine Ascent and the other one from Scripture, I want you to catch something. What both of them are saying is, if we're living in a period where we're not being called to be martyrs, where we're not being persecuted, And frankly, that's the U.S. Oh, yeah, people are saying bad things about us, but I remember what I was taught when I was a young kid and started learning some of the sayings in this country. And I learned the saying, sticks and stones may hurt my bones, but words, you can finish it, right? In the U.S., frankly, what we tend to receive are words. There's a lot of countries where what they get are sticks and stones. So how do you become a saint? If you're, married or you're working in the world and, nobody's really persecuting you, and quite honestly, in the U.S., what we get is verbal slaps. That's honestly not persecution. How do you become a saint? Notice what the answer was. If you're a tax collector, collect no more than is appointed for you. If you're a soldier, don't intimidate anyone or make false accusations. Be happy with your wages. Do the good you can. Do not steal, do not lie. What both are saying is that we are to live a life that reflects the values of the kingdom and the values of loving God and loving one another. You notice that in none of these practical advices does it say give away every cent that you own. And I know the Lord said that in one of the Gospels, and the monks do that. But when we read St. John of the Ladder, when we read John the Baptist, to become a saint is to behave in practical ways toward others in such a way that they can recognize that you're a Christian. You're the person who, when somebody needs help, they know they can come to you, not necessarily because you're going to give them vast amounts of money, but because you're going to find some way to help them out. You're the sort of person that they know that if they come to you and you are a plumber or an electrician, you're not going to overcharge them. You're going to do your work correctly. You're going to treat them in the right way. In the book of James, it adds one more, and it talks about the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. It tells business owners, and apparently where James was, the business owners were a little troublesome. It says, you're paying fair wages. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole what is a fair wage. But I will suggest that if in doubt, pay more rather than less. Because the whole attitude of Scripture is give it away if you can. I have been a lab manager. I do know that you can't pay everybody $40 an hour because otherwise you'd close up. That's not what I'm talking about. But a good rule of thumb, if you happen to be an employer, is if in doubt, pay more instead of paying less. And so on this day of All Saints, and I'll finish here, it started out by celebrating the martyrs. And then it became celebrating all the saints. And then you and I were also added, at least by way of All Souls Day or All Faithfully Departed. The answer to the question of how do we become saints is that we live the life that we have been placed in. Notice both of them talk about going to church or going to temple in such a way that it becomes clear that we love God and that we love our neighbor, and that becoming a saint is a practical matter. It is not necessarily of great fasts and great prayers, though I honor the monastics. It is about setting an example before the world that we are indeed saints. And thereby you will draw near to the kingdom of heaven. In the name of the Father,